Hi again. Okay, moving forward to Charlotte Perkins Gilman and the Yellow Wallpaper. So Perkins Gilman was alive in the late 19th and early 20th century. She was from the US, so she's from Connecticut. This piece of work was published in 1892, so you'll see we're going way back here to the 19th century, but there's a reason for that. Many identify the Yellow Wallpaper as a quintessential feminist American piece of writing. If you wouldn't be willing to go that far, at least many identify this short story as holding a primary role in dealing with women's issues. So if you were to go and tell someone who's familiar with literature of the US that you were in a women's writing class, it is very likely that they would then ask you about the Yellow Wallpaper, because this is piece of literature that's widely known and identified as a piece of literature that's concerned with women's issues. While much of her life does show similarities and commonalities with the narrator of the Yellow Wallpaper, we don't want to think about the short story as autobiographical. It's a little too limiting, and this is a piece of fiction, so in other words, it's creative, it's imaginative, it's a story. It's not necessarily a description of her life. So some of the similarities is Perkins Gilman did struggle in a marriage. She struggled with depression, and she very often questioned women's roles. In fact, there's a novel that I recommend if you're at all interested in reading more of Perkins Gilman, which is called Herland. Overall, Gilman questioned why child rearing was done by only women. And she included many of her questions of patriarchal values and roles for women in her writing. So her ideas about family, about home, about marriage, etc. All right, to analyze the Yellow Wallpaper, we can definitely think about setting. So the historical moment in which the narrator lives. We could also think about theme. We can think about genre. So this story is in the form of a short story, a short piece of fiction, but it's also in the form of a diary. We could certainly think about metaphor. So we might want to ask ourselves, what is the Yellow Wallpaper a metaphor standing for? Both for the narrator herself, but also how does the Yellow Wallpaper serve as a metaphor? How does it function for us as readers? In terms of theme, it might be helpful for us to think about the theme of the Yellow Wallpaper as the suppression of women by duty. So in other words, how women of this historical moment were suppressed by the duties of womanhood. Others have identified the theme or even overall message of this short story as escaping patriarchal roles for women. I also think that it's helpful for us to consider the pursuit of creativity or documentation or writing. So we might question why writing was considered a forbidden act in this short story, even though the narrator continues to pursue this forbidden act. Illness plays an important role in this piece of literature. We might also question how that's brought on. So it's not just a biological or neurological condition, although we do see some evidence to suggest that it is. We see that the narrator is just recently a mother, so we could maybe extrapolate that she's suffering from postpartum depression. But in the short story, illness is not just a biological or neurological condition. In fact, it's a social condition. So we might see the story overall as demonstrating that patriarchy is a social ill. In other words, it's a social problem that makes people ill, or in other words, harms people. So some questions that you might consider about the Yellow Wallpaper, and since we're not meeting together to discuss these today, these might be things that you pursue in your follow-up on the ideas of a peer, which is due tomorrow, Tuesday the 20th, before midnight, or this may these may be questions that you can pursue when you're in a small group discussion in class on Wednesday. You might also consider, when commenting on the ideas of peers, considering also commenting on genre or theme, or if the use of literary devices and using literary terms can help you when you're following up on the ideas of peers on that discussion board. Okay, so questions to consider. Several times at the beginning of the story, the narrator says such things as, what is one to do? What can one do? What do these comments refer to? What, if anything, did they suggest about women's roles at the time of the story? So when this story was written and when this narrator lives. The next one, the narrator says, and this is from paragraph 24, I get unreasonably angry with John sometimes. In your view, how unreasonable is her anger at John? What does the fact that she feels unreasonable about having anger say about the character, her thinking, and perhaps the time period? Overall, what do the narrator's changing feelings about the wallpaper tell us about the changes in her condition? In paragraph 122, the narrator says, it is so hard to talk with John about my case because he is so wise and because he loves me so. John's wisdom, to say the least, is open to question for us as readers. But what about his love? What do you think in seeing this narrator talk about John's love for her? How does that influence you in your reading? If you had to pinpoint a place, where precisely in the story do you think it becomes clear that the narrator has begun to hallucinate, where the description of the wallpaper is outside of our reality? What does the woman behind the wallpaper represent? Why does the narrator come to identify with her? And finally, how ill does the narrator seem at the beginning of the story? How ill does she seem at the end? How do you account for the change in her condition? What happens to her condition? And how do you understand or interpret it? I do believe we'll be able to include some discussion of the yellow wallpaper in class on Wednesday, although your priorities for those small group discussions will be the assigned reading for Wednesday. One is a short story by Gloria Anzaldúa, and the other a collection of flash fiction by Vivek Shara, but I think we'll find time, and we'll find it'll be natural and organic, to include some discussion of all of these short pieces of fiction.